Now back to our top story of the morning, this separation policy between parents and kids at the border. Joining us to talk more about that is Congresswoman Karen Bass, Democrat from Los Angeles. Congresswoman, good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, let's talk for a moment about this policy. A lot of supporters of the president say, you know what, the responsibility is on the parents because the parents are crossing over the border illegally. They're putting their children in harm's way. Don't they bear the responsibility, not the Trump administration?
Well, first of all, they are not crossing the border illegally. People are asking for asylum. That is a part of international law. That is law that we always respected in this country. And so essentially the policy of the Trump administration is to attempt to deter people from coming over and asking for asylum by taking their babies away. It is an egregious human rights abuse. It is essentially state-sanctioned child abuse. And I'm just so deeply offended that this administration would put a policy like that in place.
Aren't you supposed to ask for asylum at a port of entry, though? And these are mostly people that are not doing that?
Yes, you are supposed to ask for asylum at a port of entry. The port of entries are backed up tremendously, and people cross where they can. Now, prior to this administration and this policy, that was always accepted. People understood that if you couldn't get to the port of entry, wherever you crossed and asked for asylum, it was respected.
So the president says that Democrats can fix this with legislation. Why is he wrong?
Well, he's essentially just lying again, as we are used to him doing on a daily basis. It is not a law. It is no legislation that Democrats did. This is a policy that his administration put in place. If he wants to fix it, all he has to do is pick up the telephone and tell them to stop doing this. That's it, period. He is unfortunately using the children and using the separation of families to try to force through an immigration policy that even his own party cannot come to agreement about.
Yeah, some are saying, is it time to pay the ransom? Is it time to build the wall, which would help these kids and help the dreamers? And why not just build the wall?
Well, interestingly, even his own party is not interested in the dollar amount he wants to spend on the wall. You know the Republicans are not interested in spending that kind of money. And frankly, if they did, it would take many, many years for the wall to be built because most of the property where the wall would be built on is private property, and they would be involved in litigation for many years. He also wants to put through a couple of other policies that have absolutely nothing to do with this. He wants to end the visa lottery, which is the primary way that Africans and Asians are able to come into the country, and he also wants to end the family unification policy. So instead of doing comprehensive immigration reform, he is essentially using this policy as blackmail to try to get Congress to push through policies that even his own party does not agree with. Remember, Republicans are in charge of the House and the Senate. They can pass whatever legislation they want to pass. They don't even need Democratic votes. The reality is they can't come to agreement within their own party.
Well, they need Democratic votes in the Senate to break a filibuster.
They do need Democratic votes in the Senate. In the House, they do not.
So what legislation specifically then would you support? Because there's a couple Republican bills in the House. What are Democrats willing to sign off on specifically this week to make this end?
So the bills that Democrats are willing to sign off on is a bipartisan bill by Pete Aguilar and William Hurd that calls for legalization and a pathway to citizenship for the Dreamers. In terms of comprehensive immigration reform, that hasn't even been discussed. The two bills that are going to be voted on this week are bills that were written exclusively by Republicans that they do not even have the votes to pass. So what we are going to do this week in terms of immigration reform is essentially just antics because I don't believe that either bill will pass. They do not have the votes on their own legislation.
Ultimately, this question is about the kids. We get into this back and forth over political ideology. Foster care is probably the issue you know as much about of anybody in Congress. You work on it so much. What happens to these kids that we're looking at right now in terms of where do they go from here in terms of the United States?
Alec, that is my primary concern. You know that we do not have enough homes for foster kids in the United States, and that is a system that was built to protect children from abuse and neglect. Well, because of the opioid crisis, we have a crisis in this country. And so, theoretically, these children in detention will be moved into foster care. Here's what worries me the most. What happens if the parents are deported? How are they ever going to find their children again? I'm going to introduce legislation that calls on the federal government to take responsibility, that if they deport the parents, then it is the government's responsibility to reunite these children with their parents.
And you think that's going to pass?
I don't know, but I'm going to fight for it.
All right. Congresswoman Karen Bass, thank you so much for sharing your views. Obviously, so many people really interested in this issue right now, and we appreciate you taking some time.
Thanks for having me on.
All right.